Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the basics of Muslim history, and the reason why I chose this topic is because I want to do more episodes where I talk about how in one period of time in Muslim history there were several, let's say, generals or Muslim commanders who were conquering places all over the world, because I think those are really interesting stories. I noticed, however, that we need to have a basic understanding of Muslim history in order to do that. For example, we need to know in which time periods there were, what the names were, what was specific about those time periods, and then we can also specifically talk about, okay, during the Ottoman Empire this and this happened, or during the Umayyad dynasty this happened. So that's my goal for today. I have to be honest, I asked a question on socials. I asked you guys, do you know the different caliphates? And most people said yes, they do. But I understand that not everyone understood what I meant by that, because I'm just gonna pull up a picture with an answer from one of you to explain that you did know it, but it showed that you actually didn't know it. And this is what one person explained. They said, yes, I know the different caliphates, and then they started mentioning them as well. And then they said Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, may Allah be pleased with them, those are the different caliphates. But that's actually wrong, because those are not caliphates, those are caliphs. And in Arabic, you would say, I think the caliphates are khilafa, and then the people are khalifa. And so those are the things I just want to explain to you. I just want to make these simple distinguishments. You have to notice, because like the caliph, you could say, for example, he is a individual leader, but then the caliphate would be the country. You could say that, but the caliphate obviously was much bigger than just a country that we know nowadays. But you get the gist of it, right? Okay, and so the reason I want you to know this is because, well, this is just the basics of the basics, to be honest. You just gotta know, okay? I'm not even gonna explain why you have to know this. You just gotta know this, okay? And I'm gonna start with you with the first one, the Rashidun Caliphate. They were people who we should strive to be. Their behaviors were something we should all strive to copy. And I think that you absolutely cannot make any mistakes when you talk about that or when you try to understand that. And I think that if you want to learn more about it, you should not listen to me. Anyways, so the first four caliphs, they established the first caliphate, or they were leading the first caliphate. And I would say they're the most pious people in the history of Islam. We should emulate them. Like, that's the whole idea behind being the Salafi movement, right? And you'll see that their behaviors are of the highest standard. After the Rashidun period, the Caliphate became positions that people inherited, which was not the case, obviously, during the Rashidun Caliphate, because not everybody was related to the Prophet, peace be upon him. The last Caliph was Ali, may Allah be pleased with him. And these are really important, it's really important to know these things. Another reason why I guess it's important, but maybe it's also not, to know these things is because not everybody has the same acceptance of the different caliphs. I mean, there's different sects, obviously, who believe in different things. But if you follow a certain sect, then you should know which caliphs are accepted or you follow, because then you can have people who might want you to follow something else. And if you don't know, you're more prone to being misled, So that's something you should definitely look into. Okay, and so these caliphs, the first four at least, they were not inherited positions, right? It was not like it went from our prophet, peace be upon him, to his son, to his son, to his son. No, they were chosen, these caliphs, based on consultation. And the Arabic word for consultation is really cool. It's shura. And I think it's a really good word to know, and it's also a really important concept to know, to discuss amongst each other what you think the best choice is. And especially like people who are knowledgeable, they are the ones who are being consulted as well, you know, powerful people, to make sure that afterwards there can also be social cohesion because people accept the choices being made. Okay, then we will have the next three caliphates. So I just mentioned we had the Rashidun Caliphate, and this is where the four successors of the Prophet, peace be upon him, came. And this is what a lot of people know. They know who these four successors are. When you ask people about the first four caliphs, they won't have trouble answering the question. But when you ask them about the four caliphates, they will. And that's when I asked everyone on social media, do you know what the four caliphates are? They said yes, but then they mentioned the four caliphs and not the four caliphates. And that's why we're doing this session today, to learn about that. Okay, so the second caliphate, right, because we just talked about Rashidun, is the Umayyad Caliphate. And this one, it lasted from around 660 till 750. And so it was the first major dynasty. They're called dynasty, by the way, because they are positions, and they are, I would say, like kind of like empires who are run by families. Okay, so that's why it's called a dynasty, because a dynasty is usually about a family line. And it was centered in Damascus, which is really cool, because that's also why Syria has like all these amazing mosques and places and so much history. It's like such a rich place, you know, because this was the center of the Umayyad Caliphate. And this empire, guys, like I literally want to do an entire episode about the expansion under the Umayyad Caliphate. Like it's literally the reason why I'm telling you all of this, because I noticed there's a little bit of pre-knowledge we need to make sure we have, and then we move on to the Umayyad Caliphate, because I want to tell you about all these like generals and commanders who were conquering like such big parts of the world, like an empire that is unmatched. Like we have not seen that in the history of the world. It reached from all the way in China, not like deep into inside of China, but inside China nevertheless, until the what we now know is Spain. So that was big, okay? Like that was huge. So that's the Umayyad Caliphate. Then we had the Abbasid Caliphate, and this was from 750 until 1258, around that period. And they overthrew the Umayyads. And so that's a part of history that I do find very sad, that like Muslims were fighting with each other to get caliphates from each other. Like I don't like to hear that. But the thing is, what's really cool about this period is this is where the golden Islamic age started, and also didn't end per se, I would say, because actually under the Ottoman Empire there was still an Islamic golden age. And so the Ottoman Empire, it's not accepted by everyone as a caliphate, by the way, but that's where you get into like all the religious stuff again. I guess a lot of people, they do accept it though. They do accept that it was a caliphate, but they will say a lot of times that it was not supposed to be, because there's hadiths that say that the caliphs were supposed to be from the Quraysh, like the tribe from Mecca, I guess. And the Ottoman Empire obviously was not. Those were Turkish people, and they had caliphs who were not from the Quraysh either. So that's one of the reasons why some people, they might not accept it, but I think everyone kind of accepts it, but they just also accept that this wasn't supposed to happen, I guess. It was the longest lasting caliphate, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, it was. So, and they controlled a lot as well. So Southeast Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. I mean, the thing is, what's interesting about the Ottoman Empire is that they also had vassal states. For example, Crimea, like in Russia, what we now know as Russia. Okay, anyways, Crimea used to be Muslim, right? I've told you guys about this. The Tatar Muslims, they owned Crimea until like not even 100 years? 100 years ago? Yeah, they did actually, because it was only in World War II that they got exiled from Crimea. But for example, Crimea, I think at some point was a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire, meaning they were these smaller states that looked for protection of the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire started getting weak as well. I think what is important is that you also try to learn more about the ones you don't know a lot about. I guess that's the whole idea behind it, right? You distinguish, I know a lot about this, I don't know a lot about that, and then you can look more into it. Okay, so that's what I want to tell you, and this is very important for the next episode because I want to tell you specifically about the Umayyad Caliphate. That's why I'm making this little episode about, you know, basics of Islamic history so that you'll understand the next one better, because I want to tell you about the expansion during Umayyad because it was so amazing. There were so many amazing people, like freedom fighters type of people, but not really. They were like commanders, you know, they were like really like fighters in the army. So yeah, I love that. Okay, then, you know what? I did want to make a note about the word Salafi because Salafi, I don't know if you know that, but in the West, in Europe, it's a very negative word. And I think people in the Middle East don't know this, by the way. That's the thing. They don't know what that means because for them, it's just Salafi as in the first 3 generations of Muslims. And those are called Salaf al-Salih, the pious predecessors, meaning the people who believed, you know, who were companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and then the generation after the Sahaba, but who learned directly from them, and then the generation after that learned from the second generation. Okay, anyways, Salafi is considered a very negative word in Europe, like even in the Netherlands where I'm from. But if you talk about it here in the Middle East, like people don't know that it's kind of used as like almost like a terrorist label. They don't know that because they really use the term from Islam, which is just like you behave at like the highest level of Islam, you behave as much as you can as the Prophet, peace be upon him. Like that's literally what it is. But I just want to point that out because I know I have a lot of followers from the West, and I think a lot of people in the West are not aware that these social constructs are made by colonizers and they actually don't really exist in Islam, okay? And so it's a political construct. It's just to steer Muslims away from behaving like the first 3 generations of Islam. And so, yeah, it's the first 3 generations, like I said, they rebranded it in the West. So, yeah, being like the first 3 generations of Islam is like considered something negative. But the thing is, they don't really frame it like that. They frame it like differently. They'll be like, it's kind of like a subsect. You know, that's how they try to explain like a subsect. And they believe in like very extreme things. That's not true because actually there's no extremism in Islam. Islam is a mild religion. Like that's one of the principles of Islam, that it is a mild religion. There's moderation. It's moderation. So for them to even say that Salafis are like extremely Muslim, that doesn't make sense. Like that doesn't make sense. You know, because according to them, being a Salafi is very negative. But anyways, I find it very sad when I hear my friends say that because I'm like, we need to reject the colonizers' social construct of our religion. Like, we know better than that. And also, when I hear prominent people talk about it, like Muslims, and they'll be like, yeah, I used to be Salafi, but now I'm not anymore. It's like, why are you even subjugating yourself to like the colonizers' version of Islam? Like, don't do that. Don't let them define your religion. Sometimes people try to make it sound like really irrational to be a Salafi, and they'll be like, oh, okay, so you want me to ride a donkey and you want me to like sleep in a hut. It's like, no, that's not what Salafi means at all. Like that's literally not even close to it. I mean, it means that we would hold ourselves to like these values that they had very high values. You know, the Sahaba had incredibly high values. You know, they were incredibly fearful of Allah, which is really beautiful. You know, they wouldn't sleep if there were hungry people in their towns. They would always be afraid that they weren't doing enough when it comes to worshiping Allah. You know, prayer, giving enough charity, being kind to the people around them, you know, emulating our Prophet, peace be upon him, who was like so soft-spoken, so generous, so kind, so friendly, so knowledgeable. And those were the things they really wanted to be. And that's what we say say that, you know, that's the first three generations. My mom always says, when you hear something, you can take the good or you can take the bad. And I think in Islam, we are taught obviously to assume positively always. And so if someone tells me to behave like the first few generations of the Muslims, I honestly will take the most positive things out of that. But I hope that, you know, people aren't like, oh, now I have to ride donkeys. Like, that's not what I said, okay? So yeah, just try to stick to really what we know of the first three generations. And there's so much you can learn from that. Like, that's so rich. That's so enriching. Okay, anyways, then we're gonna talk about the last caliph. Oh, I think this is so important, you guys. I did an entire episode about this. Like, this is to me so big because obviously I'm like a big fan of it, but like the Caliphate. But then it ended, okay? And like, in my opinion, when it ended, Muslims have been more vulnerable than ever. And I think that Muslims have been slaughtered like never before. Because if you look at, for example, only 9/11, like the cost of war of 9/11, Brown University has done a research on that. They said that 4.5 to 4.7 million people have died due to the wars that resulted from 9/11, and 38 million people have been displaced. And my personal opinion on that is, if we had a centralized power that we would all listen to and move with, you know, take guidance from in like how to behave, like what to do, how to be strategic, I think that we would be better as Muslims. We would be more safe. Like, our most vulnerable would be able to be kept safe, you know, and they wouldn't be vulnerable to maybe groups of people who don't have great intentions. There would be a central organ who would decide, you know, what would happen. So anyways, I think this amount of people, I mean, I've gone through a lot of these periods, a lot of these empires, a lot of these dynasties. I don't remember seeing these numbers. You know, this is crazy what happened. And this happened in the past few decades, guys. And it shows to me that as Muslims, we've really become like just a group of people who's being marginalized worldwide. That's the only conclusion I can reach, that this one event has led to so many people dying. Like, we gotta do better. We gotta do something better. Like, that's how I feel. Okay, anyways, the last widely recognized caliph of Islam was Abdul-Majid II. And I've explained this before. I mean, there was an end to his rule and the caliphate in general because of some of the trends that took place at the time. And I've explained this very elaborately in my episode, Candace Owens Exposed Macron, influenced by Jewish pro-feminist cult who ended the caliphate, okay? And I mean, I think we can learn a lot from what happened towards the end of the caliphate for how we, you know, design our lives now. And I would say there's 4 things that really stood out to me. First is they obviously wanted to secularize education. That's where they start most of the time. And it became infiltrated with particular attitudes and beliefs that were not Islamic. Second, cinema opened up in the Ottoman Empire, and outsiders basically got access to the beliefs and the heads and the minds of Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. And then, you know, there's another thing that I think is really important. Society got infiltrated with a specific sect that advocated for, I would say, extremist, feminist ideas, okay? And they would, for example, say, you know, that God is partially a woman, astaghfirullah. They would say women are partially goddesses. And that also meant like complete freedom to do everything you wanted, you know, sexual liberation, take away the traditional dynamic of a husband and a wife. They would literally say men are really happy because they don't have to answer to anyone. Women should have the same life. Like, I understand that you could frame that as happiness, but at the same time, women also look for protection under men. So it does make sense that a woman also, in a way, accepts his authority. If this man is going to have to risk his life if you're in danger, then, I mean, surely he's allowed to say what you're supposed to do or not. Like, I think that's something that's so weird in our society, you know. And that's also why I think this feminist sect is very extremist, because I think it's very narcissistic to expect a man to pay everything for you, but also to literally, they have to risk their lives if something happens to you. Like, that's how I see a person who's a guardian in my life, you know, the men who are guardians in my life. If something happens to me, you're gonna have to risk your life. Like, that's literally how it works in Islam. But then I also think that you also need to accept that you then, when you do things that might put you in danger, that you run it by them. Like, hey, you willing to risk your life for this? Think I'm gonna like pull out today? I mean, they should have a say in that. And that's the thing why I feel like this movement has contributed to the end of the empire, the Caliphate, the Ottoman Empire. Because once you start pushing women to reject a man's position, you know, in your life like that, like, oh, you cannot tell me what to do, blah, 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 then that man actually should also be allowed to be like, hey, but then I also don't really have to risk my life to help you anymore. And I think that's when these families actually have broken up. Men didn't feel the need to protect women anymore, because women were also like, yeah, I'm gonna do what I want, so don't tell me anything. So yeah, that's what happened during the last Caliphate. And I felt really sad making that episode, you know, because I don't think people understand how big the repercussions have been. Like I told you, if you look at 9/11 only, one of the biggest events that have happened after the Caliphate ended, and 4.5 million people have died as a result in the Muslim world mostly. Like, that's huge. Like, that's a direct result from us not being protected and not being strong anymore. So yeah, I think that's really crazy. So when you know all of these things, you know the end of the Caliphate, you know who's the last Caliph, you know like what made the Caliphate end, I think you should also be able to identify which trends lead to the destruction of a society. And I mean, I don't have to tell you this, but like, it's not just Islam that believes that. It's not just history that shows it. It's also non-Muslims who, you know, reiterate these ideas that when virtuous values in a society disappear, that the society will be destructed. You know, like people like Plato said stuff like that. Confucius said stuff like that. But then people always want to make it like, oh, we're so Islamic and so extremist. No, actually, every smart person will tell you that when you start rejecting all of these values that contribute to social cohesion, your society is gonna be destructed. Feels like I'm talking to myself. Anyways. Okay, then I just wanna just touch upon something else really small, by the way. There's also other empires and dynasties in Muslim history, right? It's not just these 4 caliphates, but those were the caliphates, so they're very important. But there were also smaller, like, let's say, empires. Like an example, let's see, Cordoba Emirate was one. He did call his emirate a caliphate, by the way. I don't know if that was like really accepted, but it was. So you had Rashidun dynasty, then you had Umayyad dynasty, and then Abbasid dynasty. And so one survivor of the Umayyad dynasty, he actually established the Cordoba Emirate. I want to talk about him more in the next episode. Then we have in the Indian subcontinent, we also have empires like the Mughal Empire, the Delhi Sultanate. I think we have also the Mysore, like that was a separate one as well. I'm not sure. But Mughal is really big, and it was founded by Babur, and he was a descendant of the Mongols. And so I definitely want to talk about him as well during the next episode. Another one of those empires is the Golden Horde. I think a lot of people know about that, right? Because it was ruled by a Khan, and I think this was also established by the grandson of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan? I think people say Genghis Khan. This is really cool, right? Because they're a very strong lineage of people. And so Golden Horde, I've talked about it before because that's also Tataria. And then, you know, the Tatars come from this Golden Horde, you could say. But Golden Horde is actually more like the colonizer name for this empire. Well, we also, in Africa, we had Mali Empire. I've told you, I've talked a lot about them before. I love them so much. I've done an entire episode, like 2 episodes about them. You should definitely go watch that. Then you had Songhai Empire and Hausa. And Hausa is also really interesting. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as well, because it was ruled for some time also by a woman. She's very famous, Amina. And then I think people definitely need to know more about that. Okay, then I just want to mention a little bit more about the different rulers, because I just mentioned we have the Caliph. Okay, the Caliph is the successor of our Prophet, peace be upon him. But then you also had the term Sultan, which is a sovereign secular ruler. It's not like a Caliph, obviously. And he had independent political and military power. And he would also recognize the Caliph, by the way. Then you have an Emir, which is a commander/prince, and that's a military commander or provincial governor. It's below a sultan or a caliph. Historically, an Emir was appointed by the Caliph to govern a province. Could be upgraded to sultan, by the way. Then you have the Khan, which is from the Turkish let's say the Turkish origin. So everybody else, like the Caliph, Sultan, the Emir, those are all Arabic origins. But then the Khan was from the Turkish Mongol origins. And it was like a ruler, a lord. It was non-Arabic, and it was used in Central Asian and Mongol dynasties. And so that's why you hear in the Golden Horde, for example, about the Khans, but also Kazakhstan, what used to be Kazakhstan, was from a Khan, right? Then we have Mansa, and that's from the Madinga in Mali, well, yeah, West Africa. And that is kind of like a king, emperor, sultan. I like to say emperor. I don't know why. I think it's really beautiful, but it's like a royal title. It was in the Mali Empire. And it signified that they were inheritors of the empire and, the highest authority, in that region, in that part of in the country. I think that's really interesting to know. Like, it's good to have conversations and be able to have these right terms to, indicate who was a ruler there. Okay, that's kind of it when it comes to Muslim history. I mean, one thing I also find really interesting for people to know is that we had major centers of knowledge in very important places like Baghdad. We had obviously House of Wisdom. Cordoba had the Cordoba Library. We had in Fez the first university, but actually there was another university that was the first university, which is Essetuna University. And that was in Tunisia. Then you have Al-Azhar University in Cairo. Sankore, I've talked about this before, in Mali. These are all centralized places where they had thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of books, which was unheard of for that time. And it also explains, obviously, why these places were so highly civilized, why everybody in the world came there to study there, why the people who originated from there were super smart as well. That's also, by the way, if you know these things, you'll also know that when people became enslaved and then exported, for example, to the New World in America, they were oftentimes very highly educated because they came from this area of the world. Because you have to understand that most of these centers of knowledge came from the African world, okay? I'm talking about like literally these 4 universities that were the oldest, like the one by Fatima Al-Fihriya, which wasn't the oldest, by the way. A lot of people say that that was the oldest university, but it wasn't. In Tunisia, you had Essetuna, and that was the oldest university. And supposedly even Khaldun went there centuries later. Then we have Al-Qurawain, I think I'm supposed to say it like that, but that's the one by Fatima Al-Fihriya, and that was in Fez, Morocco. This is widely recognized, the Western world also accepts this. Then we have Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Egypt, and Sankore University in Timbuktu, Mali. So those 4 are just in the African continent, guys. I mean, whenever anyone says anything about Africa, you really need to be able to summarize that because it's really important. But then House of Wisdom, obviously, Beit al-Hikmah. There have been many of the Muslim scholars who we know, like Al-Kharizmi, for example, who worked there. And it's really cool because like when you read about many of these intellectuals, you'll see that they were there in House of wisdom, and you're like, did they meet? Like, did they have tea together? Like, I just wonder, like, how did it impact them that they would go, you just like see like Al-Kharizmi's like just chilling there working. Like, does it affect you? I think I once read an article about, or research it was, about how being in the vicinity of another person who's like very productive, it makes you productive as well. Like, for example, at work, I mean, that must have really meant a lot of good things for the House of Wisdom. Then you have obviously the Great Library of Cordoba. I think the one thing that's really memorable, I think, about this library, I think a lot of people notice, is that it was run by Lubna of Cordoba, right? And she was a woman, which was like unheard of in the Muslim world. This woman was running one of the biggest libraries. It contained supposedly like 400,000 manuscripts. Like, it contained up to 400,000 manuscripts, okay? And like the libraries in Europe, these Christian libraries, churches, they would hold up to like maybe a few hundred. And then you have to understand, women were not even allowed to go to school in Europe. And then in Cordoba dynasty in the 10th century, a woman was running this incredible centralized place of intelligence, and then like it took like 9 centuries before in the West women were allowed to study. Like at the university I went to, women were only allowed to study there in 1989. 89, guys, or 88, 89, doesn't matter, way too late. And the reason why was because it was a very elite university, so obviously women weren't allowed to go there. And then you see literally Cordoba, and then Lubna of Cordoba ran that whole place. It's a little bit unheard of, okay, These are the reasons why you need to know these things. When people say anything about Africa, go back to the first universities in the world. They were in Africa. When anyone says anything about women in Islam, go back to Cordoba. When women in the West for 9 centuries weren't allowed to study, women in Cordoba were running these places, okay? Okay, then we get to the most emotional part of this episode, the end of the Islamic Golden Age and the Caliphates. So there's several ideas about the end of the Islamic Golden Age and the existence of the Caliphates. I'm very curious what you think is the reason the Islamic Golden Age ended. Like, I literally want to know from you, why do you think we flourished for centuries? Yeah, we flourished for centuries, but then that ended. What was the reason? What was the reason why? Okay, and so anyways, there's several reasons people, mention. I think one person I once spoke to said the destruction of the advanced knowledge center. So let's say Cordoba, the library got burned down. House of Wisdom got burned down, that's just crazy. They just burned it down. Like, I can't believe it. Okay, anyways, that's one thing. Another thing people say is the hesitation of the Muslim world to adopt printing press. I don't know about that. That one doesn't really hit me, okay? Then, very recently, I went to a lecture in the Museum of the Future, and the lecturer said it's because the Muslim world stopped investing in arts and philosophy. It really hit me. Like, that really hit me, because I'm like, I need to go to more lectures about arts and history. I need to go to more, like, museums. I need to, like, be a philosopher. Like, I don't know, but I need to change my life. Like, that's how I felt when I heard that. I'm trying to talk about it with my friends as well. Like, what are we supposed to do then, I think he might have a point there, though, because I'll tell you what. Iran right now holds the most smart people in the world, okay? Like, this has been tested, proven, whatever. Iran is also known for being super artistic. Like, their art scene is like on another level, where other countries in the Muslim world kind of toned it down, became more conservative. And I actually support that. Like, I don't want to have art in my house with like faces. I don't want to listen to music. I don't want to do things that are anti-Islamic and then call it Islamic art. Like, that's just not how I feel. But like, Iran did, though. Iran, they definitely kept that art scene alive. But I also feel like this is one of the reasons why they're the smartest people in the world. It's really giving us Muslims something to think about. Anyways, something I find more important to talk about rather than the end of the golden age is the end of the caliphate. Oh, this one is really, I think this is the thing that makes me really emotional, because I feel like we definitely dropped the ball somewhere. And then now we kind of got to go back and understand what it was so that we can also become better. Okay, I'm just going to mention some things. Like I've mentioned this before, right? Education got secularized, and we also let other influences infiltrate our education and just like mindlessly adopt their ideas. That's one thing. The cinema started, you know, all these degenerate ideas were imprinted into our minds through cinema, TV. I've talked about this before, the society that got infiltrated by this Jewish feminist sect that advocated for harmful ideas, in my opinion, for the Muslim world. I think the problem that we have now that we don't have... Okay, I think the problem that we have now that we don't have a caliphate is that our society is dealing with a lot of struggles that are related to not having a family system. And specifically, I would say, you know, our children, for example, are growing up not being very sure about who they are. They're confused about whether they're a boy or a girl, about whether science rules the world or Allah, and they're confused about whether what they see in the movies is what they should strive for, or whether the ideas their parents are telling them about, that should be what they should strive for. And that's why I feel really sad, you know, making this episode. But okay, I think one step that we can take in the right direction is understanding it all. You know, one thing my dad says about the end of the caliphate is that it's because of the resistance of Muslims to use gunpowder, which I think is a legit claim to make. Like, he's more interested in military strategies, but like Muslims were definitely overtaken by the aggression in some cases of colonizers. And I don't think that's a negative thing. I actually think it's kind of beautiful that Muslims weren't like that and maybe still are hesitant to do things that are super destructive, you know, like that's good. Although I do think that at some point, you know, when you're under so much threat, like for example, what I mentioned about 9/11, you know, it led to more than 4 million deaths. You know, you got to do something differently. And yeah, so my dad always looks at the kind of like the military side. I look more at the political science side because that's my major. And I think the biggest reason why we don't have a caliphate anymore, and I think this reason encompasses every other issue we have, is that we lost our identity as Muslims first and nationality or ethnicity second. And that's my observation. We've seen these issues arise in several parts of the world where Muslims weren't identifying anymore as a Muslim. They wanted to be independent from the Muslim world. And I mean, I've been creating these podcasts about Muslim history weekly, you know, for a year now. So I've like spent several days per week researching this. And this passport identity system that we created, I don't think that's working out for us. We're identifying with our passport instead of our religion. And I think the reason why is because we became more materialistic and more capitalistic. That's why we became more materialistic and more capitalistic. And I think being a Muslim would mean we would follow all the rules, you know, of Islam, which also means being united. Right? And I noticed that a lot of Muslims, they agree with me. Like they're like, yeah, you're right. We're Muslims. We're not like this ethnicity or that ethnicity. And then I always say, okay, but that also means that we should be unified, right? Because that's a rule in Islam. And then usually when I say it in favor of a group they identify with, for example, sometimes I point out that anti-blackness is a global issue. Then a lot of Muslims, they really like that. And they're like, yeah, I definitely feel the same way, you know, and especially African people, they'll be like, yeah, I love that you pointed it out because this is really important. We feel seen, we feel loved, you know. But then when I point out other types of exclusion in Islam, in like the Muslim world, it's completely normalized, you know, it's completely like a political construct because people, they believe that they have the right to hate certain Muslims. And that, I think, is colonizer propaganda, you know, and this is like intense colonized propaganda. Because, for example, I always say we also should be unified with the Muslims in the GCC, not because I'm not a Muslim for the from the GCC. I live here, but I'm not like a local. But I do think that because there is an Islamic civilization in this part of the world currently going on, that the whole Muslim world should actually acknowledge that and try to protect it and not try to break it down. But when I say that, people lose it. Like, I lose friends, I lose hundreds of followers every time I say something like that. People insult me. They say I'm bought as an influencer. I'm not bought at all. Like, I would never take money for something that I don't believe in. Like, if I really want to promote something, I would definitely take money and be like, okay, you know, this is honestly what I'm promoting, and just be, you know, open about it. But I would never take money and it'd be like promoting something that's harmful for the Muslim community. But okay, anyways, I'm also not taking money for saying this even, you know, I literally say it for free and then get attacked. But, you know, the thing is, I think it's really important. Like, I literally think it's important for us being safe, for like not 4.5 million people being, you know, killed again during the next conflict. That's why I want people to know this, you know, and like that's what I believe in. We need to normalize the not disrespecting fellow Muslims, even when it is the GCC Muslims who a lot of people think it's normal to disrespect. You know, there's so much propaganda out there against this part of the world. Like, that's my personal observation as someone who works with social media, on social media. Like, I push content on social media, I get educated on social media. Like, I see a lot of the things people are trying to push on me, and I'm like, this is not true. Like, I go through the reports, I go to the sources. I'm like, this is literally made up. There's no sources, there's no reports. And if you go deep enough, you'll find like there's no real evidence for a lot of things that people are saying against the GCC. Anyways, I think this is a huge issue. I think this is a huge reason why we are being fragmented right now, because there is for sure a golden age, you know, taking place in this part of the world. Okay, but you know, I've talked about this before. The propaganda against the Arabian Peninsula is the most intense, because colonizers throughout history from all different countries realized that when Muslims, like Indonesian Muslims, Caucasian Muslims, North African Muslims, when they would go to Mecca in particular, they would come back stronger than ever. And I shared countless of examples of this happening in, you know, this episode called the Mecca Effect. Let's see, yeah. And in this episode, I talked about, you know, how colonizers themselves, they would literally say when people came back from Mecca, they would be stronger because they followed a more purified Islam, and that was dangerous. And there's like these examples. For example, the Mali Empire, you know, Mansa Musa went literally to Mecca, came back, beat the Songhai, you know, who was trying to attack them. They took over. The Indonesians, you know, during the Pottery War, same thing. They went to Mecca, came back, unified the country in Islam. And then, you know, the Dutch were definitely suffering because of that. And there's so many of these examples where all of these colonizers were like, oh no, you know, when Muslims, they unify, they go to Mecca, they learn about purified Islam, they just become so strong that it hurts our colonies. Anyways, like, if you would really study this topic, like, I wouldn't have said this a year ago. I wouldn't have said it because I didn't know myself. Like, now that every week I'm like looking into all these stories, I'm like, you know, putting all the pieces together, I'm like, wow, they all really went to Mecca and then came back and then beat their colonizers. And I'm like, wow, all these colonizers really hated Mecca. And I think that's still what's happening. You know, I think a lot of these colonizers still know that there's like a purified form of Islam in especially this part of the world. And they don't want you to go there. So they push out a lot of fake news about this part of the world. And a lot of Muslims, they actually believe it. Okay, but I will say though, it's not always colonizers who do it. Like, I have to be really honest with you. I've seen some trends that also indicate that inside the Muslim world, there is a lot of clashes. And I think a lot of people, they just don't know how to find real information. a lot of people, they follow influencers, you know, and when I look at certain influencers, I know some of the influencers are, for example, Shia, and then they will oftentimes say very harsh things about Sunni countries, like, for example, the GCC. I've seen that personally. One of the biggest influencers right now, he's Shia. He always speaks very negative about Sunni countries. He never quotes a source. He never quotes reports. He never quotes like research. It's just like feelings. It's just feelings and emotions. A lot of you don't know about the sect he follows, so you also don't understand why he only attacks another sect. And that's why you copy his opinion without question. But what you should be doing is, you know, finding out that we have a divide in the Muslim world. There are two sides. Some people belong to one side, others belong to another side, and you need to be educated on that. And a lot of times, you know, a lot of fake news is produced by countries, Muslim countries that are on one side, and they produce it against the other side. It's like, that's just how life works. Like, I love Muslims. I never want to talk badly about Muslims, but this is something I have to admit. This happens, you know, and you know, sometimes it's not even Sunni Shia. I mean, sometimes I also see that, for example, I don't think a lot of people are aware of this, but you know that like millions of people, if not hundreds of millions of people, they worship graves, okay? And a lot of people, I guess, I at some point was not aware of this. I was really surprised why certain parts of the world were very against the GCC. And then I realized that there were certain things they were angry about that the GCC doesn't permit, that they do want to do, and one of them is grave worshipping. I'm sorry, but I literally see the comments, and I try to tell them, like, why are you angry about that? Because this is not something that's Islamic. And then they're like, no, this is Wahhabi, they're Salafi. They try to use all of these colonizer terms to, you know, make them look bad, but it's like, that's just Islam though. We're not supposed to worship graves. Like, stop doing that. That's weird. Anyways, so yeah, those are things we also need to be aware of. That's why when people give you news, you really have to be careful. And then, you know, I guess one of the things I also noticed is like this Wahhabi propaganda. Like, this is something in the Netherlands is also very big, by the way. When we hear Wahhabi, it's like you should be scared. But here in this part of the world, nobody really cares about this, because like Wahhabi is just an imam. Wahhabi, you know, he was just an imam. He was not like, it's not a movement. People don't identify as Wahhabi because it would be like an oxymoron. You cannot be believing in pure Tawheed and then call yourself after a man. Like, that's just not, that doesn't make sense, you know? And that shows you, that should show you like so clearly that this is actually a colonizer concept. And if you go back to the history of Wahhabis, you'll see also that the Soviets, they started using it, but they literally used it to indicate that someone was reading Quran or was going to the mosque, and you would be called a Wahhabi. Like, how, like, what kind of criminalization is that? I mean, the Dutch did it as well, because there were two parts in the Dutch during the Padri War who were fighting each other. One was the Adat, one was the Padri. The Adat were the people who were traditionalists, okay? And so traditionalists means they kept the customs from before they were Muslims. So they were still gambling, they were still drinking, they were still doing things they weren't supposed to do. And they were fighting the Adat, and then the Dutch were, no, they were fighting the Padri. And the Padri were like called Wahhabi because they were purified Muslims. They were like, we don't agree with drinking, we don't agree with gambling, and we're also not gonna allow drugs or, you know, any of these things. And that's why the Dutch were like, no, we really gotta stop these Wahhabis, because they wanted people to stay like the Adat, like the traditional Indonesians who were weak, who were doing bad things. And that's what the colonizers liked. So they started criminalizing the purified Muslims, saying like, oh, they're Wahhabi. Anyways, like, I've said so many, like, I've shown in the past years so many examples of this. You know, the Brits did it in India as well, because the people who rebelled were Muslim clerks. So they were like, oh, well, they're Wahhabi, they're bad, they're extremists. But it's like, no, you know, in Islam, you're supposed to fight back against people who, you know, try to take away your religion. They were allowed to do that. But immediately they would be demonized with this word Wahhabi, and we still use it. It's crazy. Anyways, I would say the Muslim Golden Age is being revived in the GCC. Like, if you look at the universities here, they look like grand palaces, the investment in arts, culture, innovation, education is something we should celebrate. And we can either choose to celebrate that and rally behind them and not believe what our colonizers tell us, or we can do what our colonizers tell us to do and speak ill of them and fight against them, instead of being unified in this like abundance and wealth and just like a lot of education, a lot of development, a lot of refinement, and just make our ummah strong again. That's what I think, okay? No country is perfect. I'm not saying all these countries are perfect. They're just perfect countries. All countries in the world, every country I studied does things, but I'm like, oh no, like, I don't even want to talk about this. It's terrible. All the Muslim countries do stuff that are things that we might not like, and I always assume, maybe I don't understand it. Maybe I don't have the sources to understand why these countries did that, all over history, all throughout the world. Muslim countries do things. I don't understand it. I don't like it. But I just feel like, I do assume the best of it. I don't speak the language oftentimes of the locals, so I cannot really say they're bad people. That's how I see it. If there's something we can learn from, I'll definitely try to take that lesson and share it with you guys, because I want us to be strong. But I think that we as Muslims need to be more educated, okay? We need to be more educated about the certain divisions in the Muslim world, about the people who try to mislead us, about the history of our of our community, so that we can also be more aware of all the threats that are looming, okay? Because that's literally all I want. Thank you so much for watching, and inshallah I will see you again soon.